What's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here with another video for you about ecology and ecosystems. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the flow of matter and energy through and between ecosystems. So let's start by talking a little bit about what living things are made of. And living things, like all things in the universe that are physical and have mass, are made of matter. And matter is made of atoms, which means that living things are made of atoms. Here we're looking at the periodic table of elements, and the periodic table of elements describes some important information about all of the known atoms in existence in our universe. And in terms of what living things specifically are made of, living things are made up of, by and large, these 6 atoms: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And all of these atoms bond with other atoms to form molecules, some very small, some quite large, and these molecules make up the structure of our body. And we're made up of some other atoms as well, but dry weight, meaning that if we take all of the water out of our bodies, basically the stuff that we're left with, the vast majority of that stuff is made up of just these 6 elements. And then we find trace amounts of several other elements as well. So it's an interesting question. If this is what we are made of as human beings and as living organisms, if we are made of these 6 elements, where do we get those things? And in fact, we get these materials from our planet. And that's because Earth is pretty much a closed system. And a closed system is something where matter is not able to move in or out of it. So if you think of our planet is made up of quite a lot of matter, but there's not really any new matter coming in, and there's not really any matter leaving our planet. All of the matter that's on our planet, including the matter that makes up living things, is there to stay. It came from the planet, and one day it can go back to the planet. Now, an interesting thing about a closed system like the Earth is that although matter isn't really able to move in and out, with the exception of a few meteorites that might land on our planet and a few satellites we've put into orbit, energy, however, can travel in and out of this system. So the Earth gets its energy mostly from the sun, and that energy then is occasionally re-radiated back out into space. So energy can enter and leave our system, but all the matter that makes up our system is contained within our system, and it's there to stay. Now this has to do with a pretty important law in science, and that is the law of the conservation of matter and energy, which states that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. They only change form and location. So all of these things that make up living organisms, all of this matter, the hydrogen, the carbon, the nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, it didn't just come into being in us, and it doesn't just disappear when we die. We get it from somewhere, and then when we're done with it, it goes somewhere. And if our planet is to maintain a balance and is going to continue to support ecosystems on all different parts of our planet, there has to be enough of this stuff moving around from place to place to be available for the organisms that need it. And in fact, it moves around quite a lot. Part of that law of conservation of matter and energy states that these two things only change in form and location. And although there's no new matter being created on our planet and there's no matter being destroyed on our planet, it actually moves around and changes form and location quite frequently. And in a big picture way, that matter gets moved back and forth between these different, what we call spheres of our planet. And the one that we're sort of talking about most this year is the biosphere, or the sphere that contains all of the living organisms. But matter gets passed back and forth between the biosphere and the atmosphere, and between that and the hydrosphere, and between the geosphere, and between all of these and each other. And if we zoom in here on the biosphere, matter actually moves around in the biosphere quite a great deal as well. In a food chain, matter is going to be passed from an organism to the organism that eats it. So, plants are going to pass their matter on to the insects that eat them. Insects are going to pass that matter on to organisms on the next level of the food chain, and so forth until it gets to the very top. And that top predator one day is going to die, and decomposers are going to help it to return those nutrients back down to the bottom of this system. And the same thing happens in aquatic and marine ecosystems as well. Matter is passed from the bottom of the food chain to the top of the food chain, and then from the top of the food chain back down to the bottom of the food chain when those organisms die. And the way matter is moved around in an ecosystem is similar but also fairly distinct from the way that energy is moved around in an ecosystem. And in this figure here, we can see this difference illustrated to us. And it has a lot to do with these big blue arrows at the bottom and sides of our screen. So here we can see the decomposers doing that job I just talked about, putting that matter back down into the bottom of the food chain so that it can be moved through again. However, we don't really have an arrow like that when it comes to energy. We get new energy every day from the sun. That energy gets passed along through the food chain from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and so forth. And every step along the way, they're actually losing energy as well. And when we say losing energy in this case, we don't mean that the energy disappears. It actually just gets transformed into a less usable form. So as organisms are consuming food and nutrition and using it to produce energy, they're losing a lot of energy as heat to the environment. And that's what these arrows are about. And heat energy, as it turns out, is a lot less useful to organisms than the sun's energy. And you can't really use heat energy to power photosynthesis, and if you can't use it to power photosynthesis, then you can't use it to grow plants, and then you can't grow plants to support animals. So that heat energy is lost in the sense that it becomes kind of useless to organisms in the food chain. So the food chain has to be replenished with energy by the sun. So the big picture here is that matter gets recycled. Matter goes around and around in circles. Energy, however, comes in from the sun, goes through the food chain, and becomes less usable at every step of the way. In fact, we estimate that about 90% of the energy at each trophic level, or at each feeding level, is lost before it gets up to the next energy level. So if we look at this pyramid from that perspective, that means that our herbivores here are only getting about 10% of the energy that's available in the level below them. And our first level carnivores are only getting about 10% of the energy that's in the level below them, which is only 10% of the energy below that. So this actually creates limits on how tall this pyramid can be. Interestingly enough, this pyramid actually has 6 levels, but it's very rare to find more than 4 or 5 levels in any given food chain because energy becomes less and less available the farther up the food chain we go. And we simply don't have as many top carnivores in an ecosystem because there's not enough energy to support them. We find a lot more primary producers because they're a lot closer to that ultimate source of energy, the sun. So that explains how matter and energy get moved through the biosphere, but matter and energy get moved through all of the different spheres of our planet, not just the biospheres. And next we're going to learn about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So let's start with the water cycle. And on this figure here, the arrows represent the direction that water is getting moved around. And remember, water is made of both hydrogen and oxygen. So of those 6 elements that make up living things, both hydrogen and oxygen are getting moved around through the water cycle. So the arrows are telling us about how this molecule is getting moved around through the different spheres of the Earth, and the numbers represent the relative amount that's moving along each pathway. And the water cycle is a good one to start with because you're probably familiar with a lot of these things already. So water evaporates, it turns from a liquid into a gas, and that takes water up into the atmosphere. When it condenses from a gas into a liquid or a solid, it precipitates back down to Earth as rain, snow, or hail, or something like that. Or it could precipitate back down onto ice fields and become something like a glacier. Water then also can infiltrate its way down into the ground and occupy this place that we call groundwater or aquifers. From there, that water can be taken up to the main levels of the soil and then up into land plants, or humans might extract that water for our own uses, for irrigation or something like that. Transpiration is the movement of water from plants back into the atmosphere. And they release that water as vapor through the pores in their leaves. So that's a big role that living organisms play in the water cycle. Water can be extracted from rivers as well, or runoff from rivers back into the ocean. It can seep from groundwater into the ocean or into rivers and things like that. And ultimately, this water is just getting moved from place to place. So that's the water cycle. And in this diagram, we can see that water is being moved back and forth between the biosphere, through the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and down here in the ground, that's what we would consider to be the geosphere. So that's also why we call it a biogeochemical cycle. These things are getting moved around through the biosphere, the geosphere, and all the other spheres of the Earth. Next, we have the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle works a lot like the water cycle, but the pathways are a little different. Arrows still represent how carbon is moving around. The numbers still represent the relative amount that's being moved along each pathway, but the processes themselves are quite a bit different in this case. If we start here in the atmosphere, we can see that carbon is taken out of the atmosphere through what this diagram calls GPP. And GPP stands for gross primary productivity. And if you think about what you know about primary productivity, that's what primary producers are doing. They're photosynthesizing in this case, and photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide as an input. So they're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and transforming that carbon into carbon that ultimately then gets cycled through the food chain. When an animal is to eat that plant, that carbon is going to move into that animal, and if that animal breathes, it's going to breathe out carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Or if that animal is going to die, then that carbon could be returned to the soil through decomposition. Plants are also respirating, which is something that a lot of people forget. It just happens that they're doing more photosynthesizing than they are respirating. So they're taking in more carbon from the atmosphere than they're putting back, but plants have to turn around and use some of that carbon as well, and they end up putting a little bit of carbon back into the atmosphere. This part here, the ocean-atmosphere exchange, is a pretty big one, and carbon in the atmosphere gets dissolved as dissolved gas into the surface of the oceans, and then as the oceans fluctuate in temperature, that gas comes back out of solution and goes back into the atmosphere. So carbon is literally moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between the atmosphere and the oceans all the time. Sedimentary rocks contain a great deal of carbon, and that stuff can be released into the atmosphere through volcanoes and hydrothermal emissions, and then humans can dig up that carbon in the form of fossil fuels, and then as we burn those fossil fuels, we put that carbon back into the atmosphere as well. A little carbon also gets moved around by way of weathering and erosion and by runoff, and it leaches out of rocks and things like that, gets dissolved in water and carried out in some river somewhere. But an important thing to notice here is how many of these arrows go up into the atmosphere and how few of them come back out of the atmosphere into land-based systems. This one here is the big one that actually keeps carbon in land-based ecosystems. In the ocean-atmosphere exchange, carbon is going back and forth in kind of roughly equal amounts, but photosynthesis is the main process that takes carbon back out of our atmosphere from all of these processes that are putting carbon into the atmosphere. So this is another really important role of primary producers, is helping to balance the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that affects how warm our planet is overall. Let's take a closer look at the nitrogen cycle. And just like we did with the carbon cycle, we are going to start in the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is actually a huge reservoir of nitrogen. More than 70% of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen gas. The only problem is that this nitrogen is not really usable by the vast majority of living organisms. But living organisms, a certain small subset of them, play a very, very important role in turning that unusable atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen. And that's this part of the cycle right here, this thing that we call natural biological fixation. And it's carried out primarily by bacteria. Here in this picture, we can see a very special relationship between bacteria and these plants that we call legumes. And legumes are going to be plants like the ones that produce beans, lentils, peanuts, and things like that. So these legumes have a very special relationship with soil bacteria. And these soil bacteria actually grow in these little nodules on the roots that we can see here. And if we zoom in on them over here in this diagram, all of these little pill-shaped structures are those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And they play a very important role in the nitrogen cycle. They do something that's called nitrogen fixation, which is when unusable atmospheric nitrogen is converted into usable soil nitrogen. And then this usable soil nitrogen can be absorbed by plants and incorporated into those plants. Animals that eat those plants can then use that nitrogen, and then animals that eat those animals can use that nitrogen. So this is the pathway that allows nitrogen to get into the food chain. And these bacteria play a very important role in that process. And in addition to these nitrogen-fixing bacteria that we just talked about, which have a very special relationship with legumes, there are also bacteria living in the soil that we call nitrifying bacteria. And they're involved in a process called nitrification, which is when ammonium ions are converted into nitrates. Basically, these bacteria are converting one form of nitrogen into a different form of nitrogen, so that organisms that can't use one are able to take advantage of the other one. And there's also some bacteria living in the soil that are involved with a process called denitrification. And these soil bacteria actually take usable soil nitrogen and turn it back into that unusable nitrogen gas and then put it back into the atmosphere, kind of balancing this cycle out. So let's go back and take a look at our diagram again and see how that fits into the greater nitrogen cycle overall. So remember, we were just looking at this part here, the natural biological fixation, which takes place down in the soil. From there, nitrogen gets moved into plants, from plants to consumers, and then back into the soil when those consumers die and are decomposed. Additionally, humans get involved in the nitrogen cycle by taking fossil fuels and burning them, and those fossil fuels have some nitrogen in them, so that puts nitrogen up into the atmosphere. That form of nitrogen then can be deposited back onto the land and into the water by rain, and can also run off into our rivers, which then can potentially run off into our oceans. Humans have also developed technology that allows us to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere through something called the Haber-Bosch process and turn that into fertilizer. And then we put that fertilizer on our crops, which puts that nitrogen back into the soil. And finally, let's take a look at the phosphorus cycle. Now, the phosphorus cycle is distinct from the other cycles that we've talked about so far because there's nothing really going on in the atmosphere during the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus doesn't really ever exist as a gas, so phosphorus never really gets up into the atmosphere. Phosphorus does, however, exist in rocks. That's the primary place where we find phosphorus on our planet. So as rocks are broken down into soil and dust by way of erosion, sometimes that gets blown around through the atmosphere, but if you look at this number here, that's really a very small amount of phosphorus. Although there's not a lot happening in the atmosphere during the phosphorus cycle, there's an awful lot happening here in the ground. And most of the phosphorus we find on the planet exists in soils and in sedimentary rocks. So the phosphorus that we find in soil can be uptaken by plants, and then can be passed to plants to consumers, and then to consumers to decomposers, and back to the soil, all via the food web. Geologic uplift, natural processes that are happening in the earth, also bring these mineable rocks up to the surface, and that's where humans get involved. Humans can mine this rock and we can turn that phosphorus rock into fertilizers and detergents. Those fertilizers and detergents can run off or erode or otherwise be carried into rivers and waterways and then carried out to sea, where hopefully they can be used by producers, passed on to consumers, and then cycled around in that fashion. So overall, the phosphorus cycle is very similar to the other cycles that we've seen play out in this video so far. The only real difference is that it doesn't really travel through the atmosphere in the way that some of the other substances do. So remember, matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. They only change in form and location. And all of these elements that life is based on at one point came from the planet, and by way of these biogeochemical cycles, they get moved around from one place to another. They get changed in forms. They get cycled between the biosphere and the atmosphere and the geosphere, and hopefully they get moved around to the right places where they are needed and aren't getting held up in one place or being added too much to some other location. So hopefully you noticed as we were going through those examples that humans play a role in all four of those important biogeochemical cycles that we just talked about. We play a role in the water cycle, we play a role in the carbon cycle, we play a role in the nitrogen cycle, and we play a role in the phosphorus cycle. And not in the same way that most organisms play a role in these cycles. No, we play a much more active role in these cycles because humans, unique from a lot of other animals, in fact, unique from pretty much all other animals on the planet, have the ability to modify our environment to suit our needs. So, how do our activities affect these biogeochemical cycles? And perhaps more importantly, what are the consequences? Ecosystems on our planet have struck a very delicate balance as matter and energy are changing locations. Human activities, however, can disrupt that delicate balance. Sometimes we slow down the transfer of nutrients from one place to another. Other times we speed it up. But in all cases, it's important to be aware of how our actions affect the environment, because ultimately the environment supports us in our daily lives, and therefore we want to support the environment so that it can continue to give us the things that we need to stay alive and happy on planet Earth. Alright, so that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need to until you feel like you understand the concepts. Have a good one.